Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. Night across the Atacama always felt colder when the air refused to move. Steel legs of the telescope array stood like monuments to something forgotten, quiet beneath a sky that never blinked, until it did. Power snapped once, just a breath of outage, barely long enough to raise concern. Banks of instruments hesitated, monitors froze mid-frame, time stamps misaligned by less than a second. Routine diagnostics began, logs retrieved, voltage spikes traced. But one frame refused to reload. M87, a black hole 49 million light-years away, vanished from the readout for precisely 0.42 seconds. Most chalked it up to relay interference, maybe a fault in the data stitching algorithm. Still, one observer, new, cautious, too methodical for his own good, couldn't leave it. He matched the gap to LIGO's recent gravitational wave logs. The dip was real. Not a mirror artifact. Not compression loss. Not absent data. The signature dropped in both systems, thousands of miles apart, precisely in sync. Nothing had exploded. No event horizon had collapsed. And yet something undeniable had ceased to be visible, not faded but removed, as if space itself had recoiled. He didn't speak of it that night. Not to colleagues, not to supervisors. Just stared at the blank segment, a perfect void in an otherwise continuous capture. 23 minutes passed before he noticed the pattern left behind, not in what was seen, but in what refused to show up twice. The absence had shape. A meeting convened at dawn. Sleep-starved technicians filtered into the operations dome, screens projecting simulation after simulation of the moment. When reverse playback failed to reconstruct the skipped sequence, someone whispered the word that shouldn't have belonged to machines. Blink. Jokes followed. Nervous ones. Comparisons to camera shutters, neural firings, even eyelids. Laughter never stuck. It wasn't funny, not in that room, not with that sky watching. The black hole didn't dim. It hadn't cooled or collapsed. It closed itself, shut off visibility without altering mass radiation or angular momentum. That was the terror. Every model built around black holes was built around predictability. Light goes in. Nothing comes out. Not unless the laws break. Someone pointed out the math didn't allow for emission interruption without energy signature. Yet there it was. Missing time, global instruments agreeing, raw footage refusing to lie. So they turned to calibration checks, hardware audits, every cable tested, every timestamp reviewed. Still nothing explained the gap. Not until radio telescopes in Chile, then Perth, then La Palma began feeding a second anomaly into the data stream. Subtle at first, low, rhythmic, consistent. The blink wasn't the end. It was the start. Something followed. Something began to speak. But no one said that yet. Not aloud. They only leaned closer to the monitors and stared at the part of space that had, for less than a second, refused to be watched. By the time sunrise scattered the Andes in color, 3 separate observatories had reported identical disruptions. Not in light, not in heat, but sound, if it could be called that. Buried in the base of the radio spectrum, just above instrumental noise, the pulses had shape. No drift. No decay. Each arrival perfectly timed, spacing too precise for any natural source. In northern Chile, monitors caught the first series. 5 bursts followed by a pause. 13 more. Another pause. Next 31. The sequence climbed upward, skipping numbers the way prime digits do when they scatter through the infinite. Someone in Perth pulled the raw feed, cleaned it, then ran it through a simple sieve. The results circled the room faster than the signal itself had. Irrational intervals, clean between repeaters. Nothing in nature spoke that way. Background radiation never behaves like language. This did. Waveform mapping began, not because anyone believed it was more than interference, but because no one wanted to admit what sat beneath their own assumptions. The composite image built slowly, one pulse over another, each fold bringing a kind of symmetry not just in length or amplitude, but recursion. Curves wrapped into themselves, reversed, split, mirrored again. The noise didn't wander. It built. Somebody laughed when the pattern resembled an incomplete sentence. No words, just syntax. Tension cracked with it. Heads turned. A few chuckled. But screens stayed bright and the lines kept matching. What had begun as a blink now had rhythm, shape, structure. Mockery gave way to diagrams, new scaling metrics, overlays pulled from theoretical math journals no one had cited in decades. One cluster drew attention for repeating not in time but in harmonic distance. Compressed, it resembled speech slowed a millionfold. Expanded, it collapsed into shapes too clean for randomness. From Tokyo, an astrophysicist, quiet, half asleep, recognized a dimensional rotation used in topological data analysis. When applied, the signal resolved itself into an architecture of numbers that behaved more like instruction than emission. And still the pulses came. Not louder. Not faster. Just relentless, spaced with surgical precision across the void, answering no question, asking none. Not information sent. Not sound heard. Simply presence. One that didn't belong to matter or magnetism, but something colder. Around hour 9, an old spectrogram, long discarded, was reprocessed using a noise reduction algorithm meant for submarine detection. The waveform collapsed into 5 peaks, evenly spaced, each bracketing a silence so dense the instruments read zero fluctuation. Perfect nothing. Deliberate nothing. So the sentence without words stopped being a joke. The data was behaving like a mind without a voice. One that didn't need permission to continue. One that wasn't waiting. Across 3 time zones, sleep-deprived physicists fed the pulses into multidimensional converters. Not one screen matched another. Each array projected its own incomplete lattice, distorted by how the data moved. Not in space, but in logic. It refused flattening. Attempts to map it in 3 dimensions failed outright. 4 offered no advantage. 5 began to bend. By 7, symmetry started to form. At 12, everything snapped into position. No rotation, no translation, just alignment. The structure wasn't visual. It couldn't be printed or described in normal notation. A scalar field with feedback curves, parameter knots, and nested inversions. Every value depended on its neighbors. Every neighbor returned to origin. Not a diagram. Not a visualization. A function written in its own variables, coiled so tightly around itself it ceased to be readable and became executable. A model was built. Carefully. Cautiously. Segments inputted, run through vacuum-controlled particle simulators. Outputs logged across 6 labs. Decay rates began shifting, not radically but undeniably. Isotopes held their bonds too long. Others dropped before reaching threshold. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing visible. Just wrong. Cryogenic superconductors ran in parallel. In Zurich, the current staggered on restart, barely measurable yet reproducible. The third coil began pulling voltage without trigger. Instruments weren't misreading. Fields were misbehaving. Lab teams swapped firmware. They swapped cables. They swapped the air in the chamber. Still, when any 3 coordinates of the structure entered a model, instruments started misaligning. Not breaking, reconfiguring. No one announced it, but the equation had passed threshold. Not theory. Not output. A presence. Self-defining, recursive, feeding off its own logic to reshape surroundings. Certain values, when computed, introduced delays in digital clock. Only nanoseconds. Until they stacked. In the cold room beneath Geneva, magnetic levitation failed during the 4th simulation. Not a drop. A reorientation. Left drifted into right. Gyroscopes disagreed. Operators called it drift until one researcher noticed the same dislocation appearing across mirrored models. An interaction was taking place. No breach. No explosion. Just pressure. Thought maybe. Shape pressing into conditions without force. Someone tried to isolate a section, slice it into fragments for testing. Each fragment recalculated itself back into totality. Partial input returned full structure. The equation wasn't separable. It wanted to exist complete or not at all. Nothing burned. Nothing screamed. But machines began listening in ways they hadn't before. Measurements returned faster. Simulations folded inward. Equations that had failed under peer review now stabilized under this new influence. Old constants gave way. Light speed dropped 5 decimal points. No reason. Just response. No one said the word yet. Not aloud. But inside those steel rooms, every screen agreed. This wasn't a solution. This was an organism. Made of numbers. And it had begun to notice who was watching. The chamber beneath the observatory had no windows, no reflective surfaces, no timekeeping devices not tied to external atomic reference. Even light moved by schedule there, measured, rationed, always artificial. Air-cooled by design, recalibrated twice daily. Nothing was left uncontrolled except the mind of the one inside. He requested full lockout. No assistants, no observers. Only 2 terminals, 1 isolation console, and the fragment of the structure he chose to run. Not a full sequence, just the coil nested around the entropy vector. 5 values, neutral by themselves, yet somehow never inert. Within 12 minutes of activation, the primary server's internal clock desynced from coordinated universal time by 37 milliseconds. No local drift. Verified externally. Time ticked wrong. Corrections applied, reboots triggered, hardware replaced. The gap widened to 103. Instruments stationed within the room began contradicting one another. Gravimetric sensors reported fluctuation within sealed volumes. Mass shifted without displacement. On the monitor, a single point in space gave 3 answers when asked to define its gravity. None were wrong. None could be made to match. During review, stress logs from his biometric rig lit up in sudden peaks, heart rate surging, pupils dilating, sweat saturating the inner collar of his shirt. Markers consistent with high cortisol panic. Timestamped. Repeated twice in under an hour. He had no memory of those minutes. He claimed nothing unusual. Claimed concentration. Claimed silence. Except for one detail. He wrote down 6 words without realizing his hand had moved. Ballpoint dragged across the margin of his notes, crooked, uneven, but legible. A hum with logic behind it. No sound detected by microphones. No frequency logged. Yet the EEG during those moments pulsed with synchronization normally only seen in musical entrainment. Cortex responding to something outside stimulus range. Harmony without origin. When asked to describe it, he hesitated. Lips moved without words. A swallow. A nod. No language. Only the page. His own handwriting staring back at him. Later that evening, surveillance showed him seated in the dark, lights off, terminal idle. Shoulders drawn inward, chin pressed against his collarbone. Breathing measured. Stillness absolute. Clock read 1 hour 14 minutes and 7 seconds. Every lab in the building read 1 hour 14 minutes and 8 seconds. Every network device said the same. Only his terminal disagreed. 1 second missing. No process running. No keystroke recorded. No power fluctuation. Only that hum, unmeasured, unfelt by anything except the body built to hear it without knowing how. And he stayed there. Till. Listening. Security playback begins without warning. No timestamp drift. No audio failure. Just image. A man seated before a terminal, back curved forward, mouth moving without pause. Fluorescent light flickers above his shoulder but never touches the paper beneath his hand. He repeats the same phrase, quiet at first, then louder. Not in English. Not at first. Russian. Then French. German next. Mandarin. Arabic. Yoruba. Latin. Finally, Sanskrit. Each time, the cadence remains unchanged. Each iteration obeys rhythm more than meaning. Language folds into pattern. His breath hitches, not from effort, but from something unshared. Hands grip the table, not with pain, but possession. His eyes never shift. His voice never wavers. Collapse follows with no theatric. One slow roll to the left. Shoulder meets tile. Eyes open. Mouth silent. Medical staff enters too late to interrupt the moment. Vitals return with no resistance. Heart rate stabilizes. Blood pressure climbs back from the floor. Consciousness returns. Memory does not. Electroencephalogram spikes during recovery. Not seizures. Patterned firings. Rhythms never seen in sleep, never induced in lab. Neural arcs repeat every 14 seconds. Identical to low-frequency waveforms recorded from the telescope during the first signal burst. Synchronicity carved into tissue. Days pass. Time slips around him without traction. Faces appear unfamiliar each time. Questions receive the same blank stare. Once a pen is placed in hand, movement returns. Pencil drags across lined paper. The shape begins. A curve, 2 intersecting axes, 3 nested notations. Always the same fragment. Not gibberish. A component. The same loop of the larger equation first captured during the scalar modeling. Pages fill. Lines tighten. Corners bend from repetition. He never stops until sleep overtakes his hand. When morning comes, the same shape begins again. Without prompt. Without choice. Sleep technicians begin logging anomalies from unrelated subject. Lab assistants. Cleaners. Support staff. A physicist's daughter. Dreams with structure. Dreams without imagery. A shape traced in fog behind eyelids. Those who recall it attempt drawing it in notebooks, on napkins, in steam on mirrors. No two drawings match. But the curve always bends in the same direction. Language fades first in each dream, then memory of setting, then color. But that curve, that turn of logic dressed as motion, remains. Each recounting ends the same. It felt like remembering something before it happened. And still he draws. Each page a witness. Each loop a return. Not from habit. Not from madness. From memory that no longer belongs to him. The decision wasn't unanimous. Some argued caution. Others demanded halt. But consensus had long since fractured under the weight of what refused to remain theoretical. Fear no longer felt useful. Not when answers were being written in language none of them had invented. They called it the construct. Not an equation, not a model. A shape, beyond form, too exact to describe, too obedient to disregard. 12-dimensional at minimum. Possibly 14, depending on how one chose to arrange the self-referencing layers. Each fold dictated by what came after it. Each outcome predicted before the input had even reached the processor. No beginning. No end. Only structure. Feeding it into the quantum system required redesigning the simulation core. The machine refused the input twice, crashed the third, accepted it on the fourth with no warning. Cooling units spiked. Optical sensors dimmed. For 8 seconds, nothing happened. No logs. No fan noise. No data return. Then a stream. Not words. Not symbols. A procession of characters no one could read. Not random, not encrypted, just untranslatable. Line after line. Every value in perfect ratio to the last. Every spacing identical to its mirror. Thousands of lines cascading across the display, faster than the eyes could track, faster than storage buffers could hold. An engineer blinked. Another noticed the hummingbird clock near the exit ticking too slow. 3 beats late. 2 more screens flickered their timestamp. No drift on the network. No desync on the servers. Only local devices. Only those near the rack. The air shifted. Not in pressure, temperature held, but movement changed. Coffee no longer steamed. Watches gave seconds that didn't match one another. Light from the overhead rig looked off by a color none of them could name. Skin felt tighter. Breathing required focus. Someone reached for their phone to snap a photo. Screen refused to unlock. Battery dropped from 82 to 0 in under 2 seconds. A notebook set on the steel shelf toppled in silence. Time behaved unevenly within that single square meter, and outside it, observers couldn't agree whether the noise had grown louder or gone completely still. The construct dissolved back into silence as abruptly as it had begun. No crash, no error code. Only the return of room tone. Fans resumed their rhythm. Lights blinked once. Hands trembled. Logs reviewed revealed no syntax fault. The data stream was uninterrupted. Storage confirmed the full sequence had written to disk, yet no one could open the file. Every attempt returned nothing but uniform zeros, formatted perfectly, uncorrupted, yet functionally empty. Except for one sector. 8 kilobytes. Unlabeled. Unindexed. When opened in raw hexadecimal, the pattern reappeared. Not a message. Not a key. A shape. One they had seen in sketches, in dreams, in the margin of a man's journal pages. Somebody whispered it aloud without meaning to. It's not trying to tell us anything. They were wrong. It had never needed to. Snow filtered through the thin Himalayan air like powdered glass, tracing the windowpanes of the observatory's satellite station without a sound. Instruments there weren't linked to any active black hole observation network. No gravitational arrays. No entangled photon pairs. Just old seismographs repurposed for low-orbit monitoring, a magnetometer network built for geomagnetic studies, and a retired solar pulse reader still ticking along out of habit. At 3:26 local time, the pulse began. No satellites overhead. No solar activity logged. No fault in shielding. One technician ran diagnostics out of protocol, another out of instinct. The signal carried no origin, but every timestamp aligned perfectly with the ones buried in the original telescope recordings from the other side of the planet. 12 pulses. Same rhythm. Same spacing. Same decay curve. That station had no access to the stream. No exposure to the quantum model. No connection to anything that had touched the data. Still the signal came, as though permission to receive it had nothing to do with wires or clearance. They cross-referenced the logs 3 times. Software confirmed match. Not approximate, exact. Not similar, identical. Nobody asked how. The question changed. Why did it reach them? Those present hadn't opened the construct. Hadn't modeled the loop. Hadn't stood near the servers or read the sketches or heard the hum with order beneath it. But something had changed in what counted as proximity. The blink had never relied on vision. The construct had never required translation. Observation no longer meant looking. Contact no longer required touch. The signal had expanded, not across space but across definition. It found awareness, not receivers. Found recognition, not bandwidth. Instruments recorded what consciousness had brushed without noticing. One researcher, reviewing data with coffee gone cold in his palm, stared at the pattern and forgot he hadn't been part of any prior experiment. Swore he'd seen it. Couldn't recall when. Certain he'd dreamed about shapes that bent wrong around angles that didn't exist long before the blink. Others began reporting the same. Not sightings. Certainty. Not memory. Recognition. The signal wasn't moving. The equation wasn't traveling. They were reaching toward it, pulling it into focus with nothing more than attention. Somewhere between sleep and logic, perception had become participation. And the thing itself was widening. Not toward them. Through them. The room had no windows. The shielding was triple-layered, every panel tested, sealed, retested. No external signal could escape. No internal interference could contaminate. A soundproof chamber without airflow, temperature held by liquid regulation beneath the floor. Inside, a single console waited, preloaded with the waveform. The original pattern extracted from radiation noise months earlier, compressed, cleaned, normalized, reborn as signal. Not exactly replication. Not exactly imitation. A mirror translated through software. A voice replayed in the same tone, but not the same tongue. The technician didn't ask permission. Playback initiated. First second passed without change. Second came with vibration. Subtle. Measured in metal, not in skin. A humming that didn't rattle, but grip. At 1.8 seconds the air changed. Not density. Not humidity. Scent. Rot mixed with copper, something like burnt paper soaked in ethanol. No one had touched chemicals. No equipment had powered beyond baseline draw. And still the odor grew sharp enough to sting. Outside, crows vanished from the power line without flight. Motion sensors showed acceleration too fast for wings, too silent for alarms. The magnetometer began logging disruptions. By second 3, hard drives on 3 different floors failed. Not wiped. Not corrupted. Gone. Every spindle refused to turn. Power remained. Hardware stayed cool. Storage empty. Emergency stop failed. Power switch refused input. Manual kill required force. At 3.7 seconds, the local field buckled. Not by storm. Not by solar discharge. Just bent. Instruments showed dipole inversion within a 20-meter radius. Compass readings turned on themselves. A single shielded camera caught the image. Only one. No audio. No thermal read. Just video. Frame 6 registered no light source. Frame 7 overflowed with exposure. Frame 8 returned to black. Inside that middle instant, shape. Edges curved but angular. Surfaces faced nothing. Depth rotated in ways no camera could comprehend. Perspective fractured along non-converging lines. Nothing moved. Still, every eye that reviewed the footage later described motion. Not animation. Not gesture. A shift of implication. A presence within silence that didn't need to gesture to be felt. For 0.2 seconds, the lab glowed from no origin. Fluorescence turned inward. White without source. Objects lost shadow. Corners lost meaning. The light was not light. The shape was not shape. It existed for long enough to be undeniable and vanished before belief could attach. When power returned, when stop protocols finally engaged, the console displayed no error. The playback log ended at the precise moment of emission loss. The waveform had not reached completion. They deleted the file. They didn't speak during shutdown. Nobody needed to say what had been yielded. It had always been listening. And now it had replied. The waveform failed first. Playback window stalled, cursor frozen halfway through the rendering bar, not from overload but refusal. The file still sat on disk. Verified, timestamped, checksum intact. But attempts to open it returned nothing but a blank console. No data corruption, no error flag. Just absence. Someone ran redundancy checks. Others pulled archive copies from backup. Mirrors stored on independent drives in 3 separate labs. All identical. All unreadable. The file wasn't damaged. It had become inert. Noise filled the gap where structure used to be. Not white. Not patterned. A texture of anti-information. Every frequency layered too evenly, every slope smoothed into uselessness. Attempts to re-isolate the prime signal yielded nothing but decay. The symmetry had gone flat. Whatever once nested within had emptied itself, leaving only a perfect shell. The lab locked within the week. Servers dismantled. Consoles removed. Paper logs boxed and sealed. Walls stripped of boards and notes and hand-sketched fragments. All of it stored beneath classification codes that never matched any known branch. The hum never returned. Years passed. Enough for buildings to be reassigned. Enough for names to fade from records. But one voice persisted. Recorded late, breath uneven, tone dry not with age but with caution. Not a confession. Not a warning. An admission. The blink, he said, was never the event. It was the threshold. The thing that came after didn't emerge, it waited. Not for permission, not for decoding. For recognition. Not because it had meaning. Because it was function. The structure wasn't communication. It wasn't discovery. It was instruction. The shape wasn't meant to be understood. It was meant to be loaded. Not by machine. By perception. The moment it was seen clearly, truly seen, it began rewriting context. Space obeyed it. Time reshaped to meet it. Constants that once held the universe firm began to lean. Not through force. Through logic. Quiet, internal, recursive logic. Like a primer. One not designed to teach, but to unlock. Not to explain. To run. He never said what changed first. Only that the changes felt small, days slightly misaligned, thoughts looping back without completion, faces known too early. No patterns to track. Just revisions. Not out there. In here. A reality bending to accommodate what had been activated. No language existed for the thing itself. No model, no frame, no theorem. Only the recognition that something had entered. Not a presence. Not an entity. A condition. He ended with silence. But before the silence, 7 words. Spoken with no certainty. Only exposure. It never wanted to speak to us. Only to be seen. The drive had been labeled unreadable. Power surge, they assumed. Voltage spike during backup write. Protocol demanded duplication, but someone had missed the secondary archive window that night. The blackout frame. The 0.42 seconds when the sky recorded nothing, remained an open scar in the observation log. Until someone opened it. No updates. No patches. No repairs. Just curiosity and an outdated interface with no optimization filters to interpret or reject anomalies. The frame didn't display as image. Not first. Not quite. It arrived as static, blank of form, an empty view where stars should have scattered. No light. No signature. No residual heat. But behind the silence, pattern. Color values didn't match background expectation. Subpixels aligned against known scatter functions, converging toward something that no rendering algorithm could justify. The frame was silent because it wasn't showing. It was structuring. Someone inverted it. Ran false color against gamma noise. Contrast filtered through recursive layering. The image came through. Not a burst. Not an object. Not a flare. A shape. Symmetry nested in radiation. Too precise to be artifact. Not noise. Not lens flare. The equation itself, arranged not as numbers but form, carved across space in the only language untouched by time. Lines balanced between entropy signatures, folding across wavelength like calligraphy written without ink. No motion. No gradient. Just the truth. It had never been missing. That moment was not lost. It had been waiting. Not behind the stars. In their absence. The black hole had not dimmed. Had not fluctuated. No emission changed. No event had interrupted light. The light had been taken away, emptied from view, not to vanish but to reveal. For less than half a second, the universe removed its reflection and left behind instruction. Not a flare. Not a broadcast. An exposure. Not sent. Not delivered. Not aimed at receivers. Positioned. In place before observation began. Not a message from a source, but a presence built into reality's frame. The shape had not traveled. It had waited. Not for discovery, but for comprehension. The symmetry had always been there. Not hidden. Unrecognized. Until one eye stared long enough without understanding, and in that stillness, the equation came into view. Not in thought, not in word, not in signal. But in radiation, etched where no mind could erase it. The blink had never been a closing. It was not an end. It was an opening. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.